Did Cory Booker just say that on live television? That's what millions of viewers were asking after a shocking moment unfolded on national TV, a moment so unexpected, it froze the entire panel and set the internet on fire within minutes. It was supposed to be a typical political roundtable, a debate on policy, live-streamed to millions, featuring prominent voices from both sides of the aisle. One of those voices? Cory Booker, U.S. Senator from New Jersey. Known for his passionate speeches and sharp wit, Booker was all smiles until the conversation turned toward conservative figures and their influence on upcoming legislation. And that's when he dropped the line that would change everything. Some people show up with facts. Others just bring hairspray and headlines. I'll let you guess which category Pam Bondi falls into. The studio fell silent. The host glanced awkwardly at the camera. Fellow panelists looked down. And for a brief moment, the broadcast felt like it had just veered off a cliff. But the audience at home? They were already reacting, and they weren't holding back. What Booker probably thought was a clever jab came across as something much different, personal, condescending, and downright disrespectful. And the fact that it was said so casually, on live television, only made it worse. Pam Bondi, former Florida Attorney General, isn't just a figurehead in conservative circles. She's a tough, seasoned legal mind with a sharp reputation for standing her ground. And to millions of viewers, especially conservative women, Booker's words weren't just a dig at Bondi. They were a slap in the face to any woman who's ever been judged for her looks instead of her intellect. The backlash came fast. Social media platforms erupted in seconds. TikTokers were posting reaction videos with stunned faces. Twitter, or X, was trending with hashtags like hashtag Pam vs. Booker and hashtag respect women in politics. People weren't just angry, they were fired up. Conservative influencers immediately jumped in. Booker crossed the line, insulting a woman's appearance to discredit her ideas? That's the real outdated thinking. Pam Bondi is a former attorney general. She doesn't need hairspray to win arguments, she uses facts. And yet, through all the noise, Pam Bondi remains silent. No tweet. No Instagram post. Not even a reporter quote. Just silence. And that silence? It was loud. Cory Booker, meanwhile, was still making media rounds, brushing off the backlash as overblown and defending his words as just a joke. But no one was laughing anymore. Not voters. Not analysts. Not even his fellow Democrats, some of whom quietly admitted it was a bad look. So, what was Pam Bondi planning? That's what everyone wanted to know. Because when she finally did speak, she wouldn't just respond. She'd dominate the narrative. And insiders were already whispering, Pam was preparing something big. A speech. A message. A moment. Not just to defend herself, but to remind the country that she's not someone to be dismissed, mocked, or underestimated. And when she stepped up to the podium, Cory Booker would regret ever opening his mouth. The event was already high-profile, a national summit on women in leadership, but now it had become a spotlight moment. Cameras zoomed in. Viewers across the country tuned in, not for a panel or a debate, but for what Pam Bondi was about to say. And she knew it. She didn't storm in with outrage. She didn't wear her anger on her sleeve. In fact, Pam walked to the podium with a calm confidence that spoke louder than any viral tweet ever could. There was no hesitation in her eyes. No nervous energy. Just resolve. The room quieted as she adjusted the mic. And then, in a voice that was steady and commanding, she began. Before I get to what I plan to say today, I want to address something that happened recently. A comment made about me, not about my ideas, not about my record, but about my appearance. There was a small ripple in the crowd. Everyone knew what she was referring to. Pam continued, unfazed. Now, I've been in politics long enough to know the game. I've been called names, mocked, underestimated. That comes with the territory, especially if you're a woman who dares to challenge the status quo. But when a sitting U.S. Senator decides to reduce a former Attorney General to a punchline about hairspray, It says more about him than it does about me."
The audience leaned in. Some were already nodding. But Bondi was just getting started. She didn't name Cory Booker. She didn't have to. The entire country already knew.
"What I wear, how I look, or how I carry myself does not diminish the work I've done or the battles I've fought.
I've prosecuted criminals. I've stood in courtrooms defending victims who couldn't defend themselves. I didn't do it for TV time. I didn't do it for applause. I did it because that's what justice demands."
Applause erupted, but Pam kept going, her voice rising just slightly, her tone firm and clear. "I have debated policy with people I disagree with, passionately.
I've gone toe-to-toe with powerful institutions. And never once did I have to insult someone's appearance to make a point. And that line, that was the one." The camera cut to the crowd.
Some had their hands over their mouths.
Others stood up.
She wasn't finished. "If Senator Booker would rather joke about hairspray than debate my ideas, that's fine.
I've faced tougher men with sharper insults. But let's be clear, belittling women in politics isn't progressive. It's cowardly."
The room exploded in applause. This wasn't just a response anymore, this was a moment. One that would be played on loop, dissected by pundits, and remembered for years. Pam paused just long enough to let the silence settle again, then gave the final blow, not in anger, but in clarity. "So here's my message to anyone who thinks they can silence a woman with a cheap one-liner: we're not going anywhere.
We're not backing down. And we're done laughing it off."
With that, she stepped back, smiled with composure, and walked off the stage.
No mic drop. No hashtags. No theatrics. Just power. The reaction was immediate.
Social media exploded again, but this time it was in Bondi's favor. Clips of her speech dominated timelines. Her words, quoted, reposted, remixed, struck a chord across party lines. Even some of Cory Booker's own supporters were uneasy. He was trending again, but for the wrong reasons.
"Booker's joke backfires" was the headline running on nearly every major political site by the next morning. And as for Booker?
Sources close to him said he was surprised by the backlash and reconsidering how he approaches media appearances. There was no public apology, but there didn't need to be.
Because Pam Bondi didn't demand one. She didn't need a retraction. She didn't want revenge. She wanted the last word. And she got it. Loud and clear.
The kind of last word that turns a moment of insult into a defining statement. Not just for herself, but for any woman who's ever been underestimated in a room full of men who thought they were clever.
Pam Bondi didn't just clap back. She commanded the room. And Cory Booker? He wasn't laughing anymore.
In fact, if the reports from inside his office were true, he knew immediately that he'd gone too far. The next 24 hours were brutal.
News anchors replayed Pam Bondi's speech again and again.
Some calling it a defining moment in modern political debate, others saying it was the classiest destruction of a political opponent we've seen in years. The speech was trending on YouTube, clipped on TikTok, and even getting stitched by creators who admitted they weren't even fans of Bondi but had to respect the way she handled it.
Pam hadn't just responded, she'd shifted the national conversation. It wasn't about a joke anymore.
It was about how women in politics are treated, and whether or not that treatment had really changed at all. Bondi's calm, confident dismantling of Booker's cheap remark had struck a deeper chord, and now even those who once laughed at the joke were second-guessing it.
Cable news couldn't get enough.
Conservative outlets hailed Bondi as a role model for strength under fire, while even a few mainstream hosts on neutral channels acknowledged she had shown restraint and power in equal measure. But Booker? His team went into damage control mode fast.
The first step? Quietly canceling a string of media appearances.
Then came the strategically vague statement from his press secretary: Senator Booker respects all public servants, regardless of party, and he regrets that his words were misinterpreted. He remains committed to respectful, issue-based political dialogue.
It was the political version of saying my bad without actually saying it. But it didn't land.
Because while Booker was issuing PR statements, Pam Bondi was winning the court of public opinion, and she wasn't doing it by being loud, she was doing it by being undeniably right. The shift wasn't just online. People in real power circles were taking note. One DC columnist wrote, "Cory Booker handed Pam Bondi a microphone. She used it to teach a masterclass in political grace under fire, and she didn't even break a sweat." Some Democratic strategists, speaking anonymously, admitted the joke had been ill-timed and poorly thought out. A few even hinted that Booker may have inadvertently elevated Bondi's national profile, turning her into a renewed voice for conservative women at just the wrong time, with primaries approaching and tensions already high. But perhaps the biggest indicator of regret came from Booker himself. During a virtual town hall just days later, he was asked directly by a constituent about the Bondi remark. For a moment, his usually charismatic face tightened. Then, in a tone much more subdued than usual, he replied, "Look, I've always tried to inject humor into tense moments. But I also understand when something doesn't land, and when it's time to listen." It wasn't a full apology, but it was the closest he'd come. And it confirmed what millions already suspected. Pam Bondi's speech had hit him harder than he ever expected. The woman he thought he could reduce to a punchline had, without raising her voice, dismantled his entire approach, and she did it not just for herself, but for every woman who'd ever sat silently through being talked down to, interrupted, or dismissed. This wasn't just a political moment. It was a cultural checkmate. And while Booker tried to quietly move on, the momentum was now with Bondi. Her approval ratings among conservatives jumped overnight. Requests for interviews and speaking engagements flooded in. She declined most of them because she didn't need to say more. She'd already said enough. One national columnist summarized it best: Cory Booker brought a punchline. Pam Bondi brought the truth. And in today's political climate, truth, delivered with clarity, confidence, and calm, doesn't just win the debate. It ends it. So while Cory Booker may have thought he had the final word in a 30-second jab, Pam Bondi proved that sometimes, the most powerful statements don't come from the loudest voice in the room. They come from the one who waits. The one who listens. And then, when the time is right, speaks so clearly that the entire room stops and listens back. Pam Bondi had made her point. And Cory Booker? He was still figuring out how to recover from it. Behind closed doors, there were meetings. Advisors scrambled to pivot the narrative. One aide reportedly suggested he schedule an appearance with a prominent female political figure, something symbolic, they said, to show unity. But the damage was done, and no photo op was going to erase the fact that Pam Bondi had flipped the power dynamic with nothing more than a speech and a stare. The story had already taken on a life of its own. What began as a cheap one-liner on live television had transformed into a national reckoning. Not just about political civility, but about how strong, qualified women are still diminished by casual jabs and outdated stereotypes. Pam hadn't just defended herself. She had become the face of something bigger. She wasn't tweeting constantly. She wasn't appearing on every news show. She wasn't milking the moment. She didn't have to. Because her words, those 2 minutes on the podium, were still echoing. Her voice had gone viral not because it was loud, but because it was real. Authentic. And rooted in truth. Even moderate voters, many who wouldn't usually take sides in partisan dust-ups, were now talking about it in a different tone. "I don't even agree with Pam politically," one viral commenter posted, "but the way she handled that was 100% class. That is how leaders should respond." Another wrote, "Booker looked like a bully. Pam looked like a boss." Meanwhile, conservative women were inspired and energized. They started sharing their own stories online. Moments where they'd been talked over, belittled, or told they were too emotional or too polished to be taken seriously. A new hashtag emerged, hashtag not just hairspray, a rallying cry against the kind of judgment Bondi had turned on its head. At conservative conferences, you could hear her lines quoted from the stage. Campaign ads began to subtly reference her moment of triumph.
Bondi's brand had evolved. She wasn't just a former state official anymore. She was now a symbol of calm, calculated resistance against political elitism. And the most surprising ripple effect? Even some prominent Democrats were beginning to distance themselves from Booker's remark. One well-known liberal columnist wrote, "In an age of sensitivity and inclusion, Senator Booker chose to punch down on national TV. Pam Bondi didn't just survive it, she flipped it into a TED Talk." Even more stunning? Some on the progressive side were defending her. Because while political lines divide policy, respect and dignity cross all boundaries. And that's what Pam Bondi had made the story about, not just herself, not just Cory Booker, but every person, especially every woman, who's been told they don't belong because they don't look the part. Meanwhile, Booker's attempts to recover continued to fizzle. Public statements lacked sincerity. He tried to redirect attention back to policy, but each new interview felt forced. He knew the internet never forgets, and unfortunately for him, his moment had already been clipped, captioned, and shared into eternity. Pam Bondi had no need to push further. She never called for an apology. She didn't demand a retraction. She didn't even directly address him again. That silence? Once again, it was strategic. Because nothing stings more than someone who defeats you with grace, and then walks away without even needing to finish the sentence. By the end of the week, major polling outlets showed a quiet but measurable shift. Bondi's favorability among independents had risen. Not because of her politics, but because of her presence. She had proven something simple, yet powerful, in a world where outrage is expected, restraint is rare and unforgettable. Cory Booker may have started with a smirk, thinking he'd earned a soundbite. But Pam Bondi finished with strength, and gave the nation something more than a headline. She gave them an example. One political strategist summed it up perfectly in an op-ed that went viral: Cory Booker threw a punch. Pam Bondi built a platform. And when the dust settled, when the media cycle moved on, one truth remained: Pam Bondi didn't just win the moment. She owned the narrative. Days passed, but the impact lingered. Pam Bondi had walked off that stage with her head held high. And with it, she carried the respect of not just her supporters, but countless viewers who had never even heard of her before Cory Booker opened his mouth. Booker, on the other hand, was left chasing the narrative. His usual confidence felt forced, his soundbites landed flat, and even his most loyal media allies were hesitant to come to his defense. The truth was undeniable: he lost this battle. Not because Pam Bondi attacked him back, but because she didn't have to. She let her poise, her record, and her presence speak louder than any comeback could. And that, in a world obsessed with instant reaction, was revolutionary. Because this wasn't just about a jab on live TV. It was about something much deeper. It was about how powerful women are still treated when they walk into rooms dominated by ego, by noise, by arrogance. It was about what happens when a woman refuses to shrink herself to fit someone else's idea of what power should look like. Pam Bondi didn't fight to prove she was strong. She simply reminded the world that she already is. And while the internet continued to debate, analyze, and meme the moment to death, Bondi quietly moved on, continuing her speaking engagements, mentoring young professionals, and doubling down on the message that made her speech unforgettable. Strength. Poise. Focus. No gimmicks. No firestorms. Just facts. Just clarity. Just class. Cory Booker may still be holding office. He may still be featured in the headlines from time to time. But politically and publicly, he's never quite recovered. His credibility took a hit that day, not because he made a controversial policy decision, but because he underestimated the power of one calm woman with a microphone and a message. And while his team tried to erase the moment or frame it as a joke gone wrong, the internet had already decided: Pam Bondi won. And she won with substance over sarcasm. There's a lesson in that. Not just for politicians, but for anyone trying to make their voice heard in a world that too often rewards the loudest, not the wisest. That lesson? Don't mistake silence for weakness. Don't confuse grace with passivity.
And never, ever underestimate the power of a composed woman who knows exactly who she is.
In politics, they say the story always resets the next day. But some moments break through and stay. This was one of them. Because while one senator cracked a joke,
one woman delivered a moment that reminded America what leadership really looks like.
And we were all watching. So what do you think? Did Pam Bondi handle this like a total pro? Did Cory Booker cross the line or just underestimate the wrong opponent? Backhand index pointing down. Drop your thoughts in the comments, let's get into it.
And if you loved this story, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next epic political moment that has everyone talking.
Because in a world full of chaos, we'll always bring you the truth that hits harder than the headlines. See you in the next one.